So the U.S. has a quota system. We have quotas on dairy from China. We have quotas on lumber from Canada. Canada. So the amount of dairy products from China, we have quotas. They have quotas on dairy products from us. Yes, they do. Okay? So lumber and dairy, and we have free trade with Canada. We don't have tariffs, right? For the most part, and we'll talk about that. For the most part, there aren't tariffs between the U.S. and Canada. So the only way we can control trade is putting some kind of quota on. So China or Canada has quotas against us. We have quotas against them. And that's because we've gotten rid of most of the tariffs. We have beef quotas. So if you're an Argentinian cow grower, right, you are wanting to sell cows into the United States, there's a limit to how many pounds of beef Argentina can sell to the U.S. every year. And if you're saying, don't we grow enough? McDonald's. I don't know if you ever eat at McDonald's. I don't eat at McDonald's, but if you eat fast food, McDonald's will only say that its beef is from North America. Yes, the beef at McDonald's is from North America. They don't tell you what part of the cow they're using, but all we know about their cows are from North America. They're not from the United States necessarily. They're from North America. Okay? So we put limits, physical limits, on how many cows can come in from various countries because we want to help U.S. cattle ranchers. All right. So what effect does a quota have? Again, what effect does a quota have? Well, if we put a quota on wheat, all of a sudden we can't import as much wheat. We just say, look, you can only import 1.5 billion bushels of wheat, not 2 billion bushels. So what happens? Well, the U.S. was producing 2, but now we put in place this quota. Okay? We put in place a quota. We just physically say this is the maximum amount of import you can have. That drives the price up. It's no different than the tariff. It just happens backwards. Let me say that again. The quota and the tariff have the same effect. It just happens in the backwards way. Okay? In the tariff system, we raise the price, and that cuts back on imports. In the quota system, we cut back on imports, and that raises the price. Is that exciting? Okay? The end result of the quota and the tariff are the same. We import less, and the price is higher. Okay, let me say that again. The effect of a quota or a tariff are essentially the same. We import less of the good that we put the tariff on, or put the quota on, and the price of that good will go up. So consumers are hurt by tariffs, consumers are hurt by quotas. Domestic producers of products are helped by quotas and tariffs. Okay? In both cases, consumers are going to pay more. We're going to import less. Consumers are going to pay more. There's a deadweight loss. Society's worse off. The domestic farmers, the U.S. farmers, are better off because of the tariff or the quota. Okay? Exciting. Okay. Health and safety rules. There was an incident a few years ago where this mad cow disease, BCE it's called, was striking in England, and so we banned beef imports from England. We don't import beef from England, but we used it as an excuse. Apparently, we think that there's some kind of commerce going on between England and Canada because we cut off Canadian beef imports into the U.S. on the excuse that they might have mad cow disease. Now, I don't know if the Canadian cows were going on vacation in England or some British cows had vacationed in Canada and maybe they had spread I don't know. But it was kind of funny that we used mad cow disease in England as an excuse to limit imports from Canada. Okay? We do the same thing with things like shoes. We put requirements on shoes about, how thick the leather can be or other kinds of requirements just to make it a little more difficult for people who live in and produce goods in other countries to sell those goods. So if you import an Italian shoe, there are requirements about that shoe and what it has to be to protect the American consumer from bad footwear. Okay? So we put in these health and safety rules. Sometimes they're real health and safety rules, and sometimes they're just there to try to stop the import. Okay? And, things are legit, right? I don't know if you've been to Hawaii, but there is no rabies in Hawaii. You do not have to get a rabies shot for your pet in Hawaii because there is no rabies. So if you bring an animal into Hawaii, it has to go into quarantine for a couple weeks until they're sure it doesn't have rabies, because the last thing you would want is for rabies to start spreading in Hawaii. Licenses. Okay? Sometimes some countries, in fact pretty much every country, requires you to have a license to import or export. What happens if those licenses take 5 years to process? Okay? So countries, you're Japan. You want to build up your own computer industry. What do? Well, you don't put on tariffs or quotas because you've signed agreements that say, hey, we don't use tariffs and quotas. So what do? Well, you require licenses. And the license has to say specific product. So you you want to import computers, in the 80s, and so you say, hey, I want to import Apple IIs. I want to import PCs with DOS 3.3. Well, by the time your license gets approved, the Macintosh is out and Windows is out, and you didn't ask for those. And when they say, oh, here's your license, you say, okay, I want to import. They go, no, you got to apply for a new license because you don't. So Japan stopped computer imports for a long time, not by tariffs or quotas or whatever, but by taking so long to process licenses that nobody ever got to sell stuff that they were making into Japan. Okay? Related to this is this idea of ownership restrictions. U.S. people cannot own 100% of a business in Japan or China. They can only own a part of that business, and there has to be local partners that work on that business with the foreigners. Okay? That means if you go look at what General Motors does in China, most of what General Motors sells in China is other brands. They sell Buicks, but the brands they sell are Chinese brands, essentially, where they have Chinese partners. And that's because the Chinese government forces them to do that. That way, Chinese business people learn about how U.S. businesses or European businesses do business, and that gives them an advantage if they want to start their own business someday and compete with us. Okay? Japan did this. China did this. The U.S., we do it in two real industries. We do it in media. So in theory, a non-U.S. citizen cannot own television, radio, newspapers in the United States. The exception to that is Congress passed an exception for Fox, so that the owner of Fox, who's Australian, I think, Rupert Murdoch, is not American. He owns Fox. He's allowed. Everybody else has to be an American citizen, okay, to own TV, radio, newspaper. And we do it with airlines. The U.S. airlines, United, Southwest, their owners have to be U.S. citizens. If Air Canada were to try to buy United, United would lose the right to transport passengers within the United States. Okay? But these are a big deal and not something that we're really addressing in trade agreements with these countries. All right, we talked about exchange rates. We talked about the fact, and this is really a macro topic, and you're going to talk about this a lot when you get to macro class. But what China did, think about the fact that we have to trade our money for their money, right? If we want to buy something from them, we got to take dollars. We somehow got to turn them into yuan, then we go buy the thing. Okay? By changing the value of their currency, by making their currency more or less valuable or our currency more or less valuable, we make it easier or harder for foreigners to buy our goods. So when we slap tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the U.S., China changed the value of their money to offset part of that tariff effect. Okay? President Trump said repeatedly he was going to declare China a currency manipulator. In the end, they did that for just a couple months. And even then, China didn't actually technically meet the requirements for being a currency manipulator. But nothing's really changed in that regard. We'll talk about that. Okay? Countries also control trade by subsidy. Subsidy means you pay your own people. Instead of putting a tax on European wheat coming into the U.S., we pay American wheat farmers. Okay? So I got two examples of this to talk about here for you. One is the European Union and wheat, in fact. So European farmers were growing more wheat than they could sell. What do we do? Well, the answer is that the European taxpayers pay farmers, and the farmers then sell that wheat below what it costs them to grow it. So if it costs, $3 a bushel to grow, you sell it for $2.75. And the taxpayers make up the difference. The farmers get what's called a subsidy. They get money. Okay? Now the effect of this has been that the Europeans have basically wiped out family wheat farms in Africa. There used to be a lot of people who grew wheat in Africa. Now there aren't very many farms that grow wheat in Africa because you can buy your wheat cheaper from Europe than you can grow it yourself. And this is a source of great controversy. The Europeans have published all kinds of stuff about how it's not really their fault and it's not a bad thing that they've done to Africa, when other folks think that this is a really bad thing that they've done to Africa to wipe out the family wheat farms in Africa. Okay? The U.S. and the European Union subsidize their aircraft companies. So that plane right there is an Airbus A380. It's the largest passenger jet ever built. The design cost of that was many billions of dollars, and it was paid for by the taxpayers in Europe. Airbus gets money every year, billions of dollars every year, from the European taxpayers to help cover their costs. And the U.S. complains about that every year. On the other hand, Boeing, if you're Korean Air and you want to buy airplanes from Boeing, the U.S. government will arrange an interest-free loan from you to buy those planes. So the U.S. government subsidizes Boeing's financing activities every year, and the Europeans complain about that. Both countries, both the European countries and the U.S., subsidize various industries on a regular basis to try to make them more competitive globally.